Test. Testing, 1, 2, 3. It's a bit on the strong side. Just a little bit lower, not too much. Ooh. Can you check to see that this is properly plugged in? And it's on? It gave a message. It said, please power off. I don't know why it would give that message. Okay, it seems to be all right now. Okay, we'll start with homage, homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. And today is May 18th, 2003. Okay, welcome back everybody who is coming back after a long time. I think we had our last class was middle of December, so it's been about 5 months. Okay, and we are continuing with the reading of the Majjhima Nikaya, and now we are into the chapter called the Brahmana Vagga, the chapter dealing with the Brahmins, and we're about to start on Sutta number 95. This is called the Canki Sutta. It's a discourse focused around or involving a Brahmin by the name of Canki. And you know, if you don't know the Pali alphabet and you look at the spelling, you don't know how to pronounce this. You think it might be Canki. But it's, the C in Pali is always pronounced like CH, like ch in church. And so this is like, you know, there's a kind of, what is that, peanut butter company? You know, they have this two kinds of peanut butter, smooth, and the other kind is chunky. Skippy peanut butter, yeah. They have smooth or chunky. So this is pronounced chunky. Okay, so the sutta begins when the Buddha has been wandering in the state of Kosala with a large community of monks, and eventually he arrives at a Brahmin village, apparently a village dominated by the Brahmins, named Upasada, and he goes to stay there in a certain grove to the north of the town that's called the Sala Tree Grove. Okay, and then the text explains that on that occasion, the Brahmin named Canki was ruling over Uposatha, which is a crown property that had been abounding in living beings, probably deer and rabbits and other animals, rich in grasslands, woodlands, waterways, and grain. And this was a royal endowment given to him by King Pasenadi of Kosala. So Pasenadi was the king of Kosala, and Pasenadi was also a devoted lay disciple of the Buddha. And if you know, familiar with the text, you know that the Buddha also had his main monastery in the capital of the state of Kosala, the capital of Savatthi. Okay, so the text continues and it says that the Brahmin householders of Uposatha heard that the recluse Gautama, who is reputed to be an arahat, perfectly enlightened, and so on, is now dwelling at Uposatha, and so they decide to go to see him. And so we have this scene where the Brahmin householders of Uposatha have set out in groups, and they're going to the north of the city, towards the grove where the Buddha is staying. Okay, now the text continues and tells us that the Brahmin Canki, at the time when all the people are going up to the north to see the Buddha, the Brahmin Canki had retired to the upper story of his palace for his midday rest, and then he sees the Brahmin householders moving up to the north, and then he inquires from one of his attendants, his minister, he says, "Why are so many of these Brahmin householders setting out from the town and moving north in the direction of the Sala Tree Grove?" And then his attendant explains to him that the ascetic Gautama, whom they call the Buddha, is now staying temporarily in that grove to the north of the city, or the north of the town, and so they're all going to see the Master Gautama. Okay, so then apparently we could see a certain relationship here, that all of the Brahmin householders who are going to see the Buddha are probably just ordinary people. You know, maybe even though they're from the Brahmin class, but they're probably just what we would call working class folk, people who just perform the routine Brahmin duties. Or maybe even they're just ordinary householders who are presided over by particular Brahmins. But the Brahmin Canki appears to be what we would call upper class, so a very high-ranking Brahmin. And he is said to live in a mansion or a palace. He has attendants, and apparently he doesn't know everything that's going on, whereas the ordinary Brahmins are sort of hipper to what's going on in the town. Okay, so the Brahmin Canki, when he finds out that this great ascetic called the Buddha is living close to the town, he sends a message down. He asks his minister to go and tell the other Brahmin householders that I too want to go see the recluse Gautama. Okay, now the text tells us, we go over to the next page, that on this occasion, 500 Brahmins from various states were staying at Upasada on some business. And now we have to be a little careful with the text when we come across the number 500, because it's always used in the text as just a way of representing a fairly large number. So we can't always believe that when the text uses the number 500, that it means that if you were to go counting, you would find that there were 500 Brahmins staying there. Like if, 1,000 years from now, when it's said that Bhikkhu Bodhi was giving a class on the Majjhima Nikaya at Tuangan Monastery, it says, on that occasion, Bhikkhu Bodhi was teaching the Majjhima Nikaya to 500 students. And somebody had a photograph and was checking, saying, where are they all hiding? Maybe they're hiding some of these students who are there, or have other students hidden in their pockets. Okay, so 500 just means, a fairly large number. Okay, and apparently these Brahmins who had come to Upasada must also have been high-ranking Brahmins. First, because apparently they're not going to see the Buddha. And then we'll see the other reason why we can infer that they were high-ranking from the argument that they're going to use against Canki. Okay, so these Brahmins have heard that this Brahmin Canki, who seems to be one of their own rank, very high-grade Brahmin, is going to see the recluse Gautama. And so they must have been disheartened, even shocked about this. And they come to the Buddha in order to dissuade him from going. And now from the texts, we know that we can infer that the relationship between the Brahmins and the Buddhists, the Buddha and his own followers, was not always smooth and harmonious. From some of the very recent studies that have been done on Indian culture, it's now been determined that we can't say that Indian culture of this period was uniform and homogeneous, but rather there seem to have been two main pockets of Indian culture in this period. One was centered or based in central India, the area which now corresponds to Delhi. It's the area was called the Kuru country of that time. And in that area, the Brahmins were dominant and Brahmin culture prevailed. But in the northeast, particularly the state of Magadha, where the Buddha often resided, a kind of different culture was prevailed. A culture in which it seems the kshatriyas, that is the aristocrats, the rulers, the warriors, the administrators, were the dominant community. And in that culture, the sort of main religious inspiration came from the shramanas, the wandering ascetics, amongst whom the Buddha was a member. And now the Brahmin culture from the central India was spreading out to the east, trying to take over, to infiltrate and dominate the Shramana-based culture of eastern India. And so when the Brahmins speak about the Shramanas, the wandering ascetics, they often speak about them in denigrating terms. They sometimes call them mundaka, which we might translate as baldy heads, or Shramanaka, like little ascetics, and they disparage them primarily because they reject the authority of the Vedas, the sacred text of the Brahmins, and they don't acknowledge the superiority of the Brahmins. And yet the Buddha was very diplomatic, we could say, in his dealings with the Brahmins. On the one hand, he rejected some of the main claims of the Brahmins. He didn't recognize the authority of the Vedas. He didn't recognize the superiority of the Brahmins. He didn't agree that people of different social classes had different spiritual capacities. But on the other hand, he seemed to know or to realize that the Brahmins played an important role in Indian culture, and so he wanted to accommodate them without acceding to the claims, the Brahmin claims, that he himself rejected. Okay, so in some texts, we see the Buddha taking the word Brahmin and then investing it with a new meaning, a meaning which is perhaps intended to capture the original significance of the word Brahmin. The word Brahmin comes from the word Brahma, which has a sense of pure and holy. So Brahma is the pure and holy spirit, and the Brahmins are seen to be the ones who maintain and transmit the pure and holy spirit. But the Brahmins in the Buddha's time had become hungry for wealth and power, pretentious in their claims to superiority. So the Buddha wanted to recapture the original significance of Brahman as one who embodies holiness and purity. And so in some suttas, he virtually redefines the Brahman as the Arahat. And so anybody who becomes purified spiritually and holy by reason of his spiritual accomplishments becomes the true Brahman, not the one who's born in a certain social class. And then in other suttas, we see the Buddha criticizing the conduct of the Brahmins of that period, particularly there's some suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Fives. I think it's around 180, 83, 84, 183, 184, 185, where the text is actually rather cutting in its sarcasm. It compares the Brahmins to dogs, and it points out how in their behavior the dogs are superior. Do we have any Brahmins here? I don't want anybody to get up and walk out. It speaks about how in some respects the dogs are superior to the Brahmins in their behavior. Like it says that the dogs have sexual relations, or the male dog has a sexual relation with the female dog only when the female dog is in season, but not at other times. Whereas the Brahmins have sexual relations at any time. And I think it says that Yeah, it says that the dog, the dogs, when they get hungry, then they go to the village to beg for food, and they eat what they want, and then they go back to their homes. They don't store up any food, but the Brahmins go begging for food, and then they get much more food than they need. Then they go back and they store up their food. Okay, so we see other texts in which the Buddha is very critical of the Brahmins. And we see in this text that the Buddha is going to use a kind of middle way approach of, trying to speak politely, courteously to the Brahmins, but also to criticize them on certain key claims that the Brahmins have about their own teaching. And what strikes me interesting about this passage, well, maybe we go through the passage, then I'll bring up this interesting point. Okay, we're coming back now to this situation where the visiting Brahmins from out of state have heard that Canki, their colleague, is planning to go up to the north to see the Buddha. And so they come to him, they ask him whether it's true, he says that it's true. And now they're going to start with a long argument trying to convince Canki not to go see the Buddha. But rather they're going to argue that there are other reasons why the Buddha should come to see you. And in coming to see, it means not just to visit, but in a sense to pay respects. Okay, so the Brahmins launch into their argument. I'm in section 8 now, so that they say, do not go to see the recluse Gotama. It isn't proper for you to go see the recluse Gotama. Rather, Gotama should come to see you. And now he's giving the reasons. For you, sir, are well born on both sides of pure maternal and paternal descent, 7 generations back, unassailable and impeccable in respect of birth. And you see, the Brahmins, they give a lot of attention to family background. In order to be worthy of respect, you have to come from, in their view, to have parents, mother and father, who are both unadulterated Brahmins going back at least 7 generations. Okay, so this is, we say, the first reason, the reason based upon birth or family lineage. The second reason, you, sir, are rich with great wealth and great possessions. So, the Brahman viewpoint is almost quite materialistic. Whoever has the most wealth is the most worthy of respect. Whereas originally the Brahmins were to be living lives of partial renunciation, and it's still a value cherished by the Brahmins. But the Brahmins, because they maintained the Vedas, the sacred texts of ancient India, and the recitation of or performance of the Vedic rituals was considered essential for maintaining the order of the cosmos. So the kings and rulers, they would have the regular ceremonies performed in their states in order to, in their view, to preserve the well-being of the nation. And they had to rely on the Brahmins and invite the Brahmins to perform the sacred rituals. And in return, everything is based on exchange. So in return for the performance of the rituals, the kings and other aristocrats would give money, land, and cattle and other benefits to the Brahmins. And so the Brahmins could become very rich, wealthy landowners. Okay, so we could say a second argument or an important value of the Brahmins is wealth. The third argument is based on learning or knowledge. So you, sir, are a master of the 3 Vedas with their vocabularies, liturgy, phonology, etymology, and the histories is a 5th. You are skilled in philology and grammar, fully versed in natural philosophy, and in the marks of a great man. So these are the ancillaries or secondary branches of Brahminic learning. The main part is the 3 Vedas, and then there are other parts that the Brahmins are expected to learn. Okay, the next argument is based on physical attractiveness, physical comeliness, appearance. So you, sir, are handsome, comely, and graceful, possessing supreme beauty of complexion, with sublime beauty and sublime presence, remarkable to behold. Seems a little puzzling to see a Brahmin praised as though he were a beauty queen. But this is one of the arguments used. Okay, then the next one, the 5th ground, is virtue. So you, sir, are virtuous, mature in virtue, possessing mature virtue. The next argument is based on eloquence. You, sir, are a good speaker with a good delivery. You speak words that are courteous, distinct, flawless, and convey the meaning. Then the next is related to status as a teacher. You teach the teachers of many. So he's a very prominent, eminent teacher. I find it a little puzzling if he's teaching the teachers of many, like he's an elder generation teacher. So under him there would be other Brahmins who are now teachers of their own groups of pupils. So if he's maybe 60, we would speculate he might be 65, 70 years old. So how do one praise him as being so beautiful and handsome and comely? Maybe I could get there too. Okay, so he teaches the teachers of many. And then the next argument is based on, you could say, esteem and honor. So you are honored, respected, revered, venerated, and esteemed by King Pasenadi of Kosala, by another elder Brahmin named Pokarasati. Okay, so this is based on esteem. And then the next argument is based on property. This is related to the possession of wealth. So you rule over Upasada, a crown property given to you by King Pasenadi of Kosala. So for all of these reasons, you shouldn't go to see the recluse Gotama, but the recluse Gotama should come to see you. So if we look at these reasons, we could see that some are superficial and some might be like authentic religious or spiritual values. Let's go through them. Birth or family lineage, would that be spiritual or superficial? Yeah, superficial. Wealth, superficial. I should hope so. Learning, it seems learning could be a middle ground, depending on whether it's just, intellectual knowledge or whether it's used. Physical beauty, superficial. Okay. Virtuous conduct. Okay, so that's genuinely spiritual. Eloquence and speaking. It's, middle ground. It could swing either way. Okay, having a lot of students. I think that could swing either way. Being honored, revered, respected. Yeah, it seems it could go either way. But let's say that there's nothing intrinsic in that, but it depends on what one is being revered and respected for. And then property, having crown properties. Spiritual or superficial? Okay, superficial. Okay, so the visiting Brahmins give all of these arguments why the Buddha should come to see Canki. But now Canki, the Brahmin Canki, replies to the Brahmins, and he says, now listen to me, why it is proper for me to go see Master Gautama, that's the Buddha, and why Master Gautama shouldn't come to see me. Okay, since Canki is a Brahmin, he's going to, consent to some of the Brahminic arguments. So he says the recluse Gautama is well born on both sides of pure descent, maternal and paternal, through 7 generations. So the Buddha isn't a Brahmin, but he's from a pure Kshatriya descent. And so the Brahmins, even though they claim to be superior to the Kshatriyas, but they still had a high regard for the Kshatriyas. Okay, so this is the first reason. Okay, now, and that's something that both the Brahmins and the Buddha have in common, pure family lineage. But now comes a difference. The recluse Gautama went forth abandoning much gold and bullion stored away in vaults and in lofts. So now what is the virtue that's being praised here in the Buddha? In one word? Speak up. Exactly, renunciation. But, if he just was living an ordinary, just like an ordinary householder with maybe a house, a little plot of land, struggling by on a moderate income, and he renounced, nothing special, but he comes from a very wealthy, aristocratic family, even according to legend, the son of a king. So he gave up much gold and wealth stored away. Okay, next, the recluse Gautama went forth into homelessness while still young, a black-haired young man endowed with the blessing of youth in the prime of life. So again, this is renunciation, but here, what's being indicated is, you see, amongst the Brahmins, or at least in theory, there was a kind of theory that the Brahmin should study with a teacher up till the age of 24. At the age of 24, he leaves his teacher. Then he has the option, which almost all took with a few exceptions, to marry and start a family. from the age 24 to the age, I think, of 48. They live the family life. Then at 48, one becomes what's called the vanaprastha. One sets out for the woods. That is, one could go with one's wife. The children now go off. They're on their own. And one lives a very simple life on the edge of the woods, devoting oneself to, again, to more religious study and more religious practices from 48 until, 62, something like that. Then at the age of 62 or so, or 64, then one gives up everything and becomes what they call sannyasi, or paribhajika, a wandering ascetic. So, the idea is that when you get to be old, that's the time for renunciation. But when you're a young man in the prime of life, you don't think of renunciation, but you think of first, you study, then after finishing your studies, then you get married, have kids, and as a Brahmin, you would perform the Brahminic services. Of course, even amongst the Brahmins, very, very few passed the second stage and went on to the third and fourth stage, the stage of partial renunciation and complete renunciation. Rather, they just continued to live as householders. So the fact that the ascetic Gautama, at the age of 29, gave up the household life, in the prime of life, to become an ascetic, that's something that at least this Brahmin, Canki, admires. Okay, and then when the recluse Gautama went forth into homelessness, he did so while it says his mother and father wished otherwise and wept with tearful faces. Sometimes this makes one a little sad, and people can say, especially also the Buddha had a wife and child, so we say, how can he do that? But because he came from a wealthy family, that the wife and child were well provided for, and his father and his foster mother, they were also well off, so he was not abandoning them to the risk of indigence. Again, so all of these are illustrating the strength of his renunciation. Okay, going on now. Again, we have the appeal to beauty. The recluse Gautama is handsome, comely, graceful, etc., possessing sublime beauty and presence, remarkable to behold. So, we read that the Buddha had what's called the 32 marks of the great man. And sometimes, if we read these 32 marks and think that the human being or a person that would have these 32 marks must barely look like a human being. But in fact, the way I would see them, they must have been very subtle, and maybe some of them are exaggerated in the text, but when you put them all together, they must have enhanced the person's physical beauty. Because I think it's one of the principles that the Buddha, all the Buddhas are supposed to have physical beauty as a way of attracting ordinary people who base their judgments on physical appearances. Not that the Buddha is trying to attract, women like a movie actor or a rock star or sports star, or trying to attract, gay men who might be attracted to him, but rather, people base their opinions or assessments to some extent on physical appearances. So the Buddha cultivates these virtues which will come to fruition in a beautiful appearance as a way of attracting beings. Okay, so this is the argument based on virtue. Next is the argument based on skill, on eloquence, skill as a speaker, that the recluse Gotama is a good speaker with good delivery, and so on. Then comes the argument based on his entourage or students, that he's a teacher of the teachers of many. So these are things that the Buddha has in common with the Brahmins. And then comes an argument that certainly goes against the Brahmins, that the recluse Gotama is free from sensual lust and without personal vanity. So these are qualities that the Brahmins themselves didn't have, because the Brahmins did marry and raise families, so they had sensual desire. And some of them, according to the texts, the Buddhist texts that are critical of the Brahmins, point out how the Brahmins were not even satisfied. I think this comes maybe in the Sutta about the dogs, though I might be wrong about this, but I think the argument goes that when a dog takes a partner dog, it remains faithful to that partner dog. But now the Brahmins can't even remain faithful to their own wife, but they have to get many concubines as well. Okay, then comes an argument which it seems is intended to, in two parts, to ensure the Brahmins that they're safe with the Buddha, that the Buddha is not a danger to them. First is that the recluse Gotama upholds the doctrine of karma, the doctrine of Kiriya. He's a Kamavada, Kiryavada. That is, he acknowledges the law of moral causation, that good and bad karmic deeds will produce their desirable, undesirable results. The Brahmins were very firm in upholding the law of karma, and they had to contend with a number of sects of wanderers who challenged and denied the law of karma. We meet some of them in the Majjhima Nikaya, who said that there's no good, no bad, there's no retribution for good and bad deeds. And so the Brahmins might have been afraid of teachers like that. So the Brahmin Canki wants to assure his colleagues that the Buddha is not going to undermine the teaching of karma. And so he also says, then the second part is that the Buddha doesn't seek any harm for the lineage of the Brahmins. Okay, then the next few arguments just seem to, I suspect that these are just interpolations, the next few sentences into the text, because they just restate the same point stated earlier, that the recluse Gotama comes from an aristocratic family, from a rich family. Okay, but now comes the argument based on honor and respect from others, that many people come from remote regions to question the recluse Gotama. Many thousands of deities have gone for refuge, for life to the recluse Gotama. A good report has spread about him. And then the recluse Gotama possesses the 32 marks of a great man. Then King Bimbisara has gone for refuge to the recluse Gotama. King Pasenadi has gone for refuge to him. Brahman Pokarasati has gone for refuge to him. Okay, and so he piles on all of these arguments, and then he uses finally an argument based on simple courtesy, that here I'm at the top of page 778. The recluse Gotama has arrived in Uposatha, and he's living to the north of the town. Now, any recluses or Brahmins that come to our town are our guests, and guests should be honored, respected, revered, and venerated by us. This is a very firm principle in Indian culture, that they say that the guest to your home should be regarded as a deva, like a god, and should be treated with kindness, consideration, hospitality. You know, we say, like, what's mine is yours. But we have to be careful. Certain guests will say, okay, you say what is yours is mine, get out, I'm taking over your house. There's a Chinese saying that I heard, it's easier to invite the gods to your home than it is to get rid of them. Okay, so first, Canki is laying down this general principle, and then he's applying it to the specific case. Since the recluse Gotama has arrived here at Uposatha, and he's staying, you know, because Brahman Canki is sort of the master of this whole town with its surrounding, with its environs. So he's saying the Buddha is our guest, and so we should respect him, revere him, and venerate him. So for all of these reasons, it's proper for me to go see him. He shouldn't have to come to see me. Okay, then the Brahman Canki adds another few sentences which are going to build up and intensify his praise of the Buddha. He says, this much is the praise of Master Gotama that I have heard or learned, but the praise of Master Gotama is not limited to that, for the praise of Master Gotama is immeasurable. And since Master Gotama possesses each one of these factors, it's not proper for him to come to see me, but rather it's proper for me to go to see him. And therefore, let's all of us go to see the recluse Gotama. And so thereupon the Brahman Canki, together with all of his visiting Brahmins, they all went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. Okay, in the rest of this sutta, the sutta is called the Canki Sutta. But if you've read the rest of the sutta, you see that the Brahman Canki is not really mentioned. He just is mentioned on one occasion, but for the rest he just drops out of the sutta.